John Jones was prepared for some family fun when they chose to investigate the Nutty Clay Cave in the Utah desert, close to Salt Lake City. He had not been to this specific cavern previously. Yet he and his sibling Josh had spent quite a bit of their youth collapsing an assortment of Utah caves. He believed himself to be an accomplished caver. However, his investigating had dialed back lately. He had gotten hitched, had a kid, and was, as of now, a clinical understudy at College of Virginia. This made for a bustling ordinary timetable which allowed for cave investigating during the Thanksgiving break. He was getting back to unwind with family. For the occasion, they arranged a day of climbing and investigating at Nutty Clay, which is viewed as a fledgling's cavern by most. The fundamental region of the cavern were fascinating for everybody. There was the labyrinth room, which had openings and passages driving around enormous rocks. There was a huge sloped region called the slide, where the whole room slanted down at a 45-degree point with a rope to direct you down. This cavern framework was very much planned in a large portion of the traversable regions. There were additionally notable regions that were seriously difficult, like the birth waterway or the aorta slither. These regions were tight and hard to pass, so just more experienced cavers would endeavor to just barely get through these entries. Even with the realized difficulties, individuals actually wound up trapped in difficult situations in these passages. Nutty Clay had as of late been freed back up to the general population, subsequent to being shut for a considerable length of time in view of cavers stalling out in these troublesome crushes. They were acceptable for some, yet others would find that their shoulders or hips would simply not pass, regardless of how hard they pulled against the stone. In the wake of wedging themselves in the tight space, they were totally stuck, requiring serious help to creep out in reverse due to these salvages. Another licensed-style passage was required, posting 2 experienced cavers for each gathering. Josh had gotten a license for a gathering to investigate the Tuesday prior to Thanksgiving, November 24th, the 2009. John's pregnant spouse, Emily, remained back at the house with their 1-year-old little girl, Lizzie, to partake in a seriously loosening up night with the parents-in-law. Their gathering of 11 loved ones got going in the super-open cavern. Segments in the end, John and his sibling Josh took 2 companions off to find additional provoking passages to attempt. They had heard tales about the birth trench and counseled the guide for its area. It was known to be a long, close section, with an especially difficult situation, close to the end in the event that you could simply move beyond the tightest part. There would be a little room toward the finish, to stand up and pivot. They realized that the birth channel would be tight and could be frenzy-prompting in any event. For experienced cavers, they spread out too. Attempt to track down this specific passage, John and Josh took the entry on the left, traveling through a little passage for around 15 ft. It undulated all over in a few heights over the course of the following 10 ft. There were offshoots of rocks and difficult situations that required a caver to turn their body in a few directions to get shoulders past, then hips, lastly curving legs. So they twist in the legitimate heading. It was anything but an issue of just getting your body powerfully through a tight opening. This region was known as the wine tool in light of the fact that the rare sorts of people who had experienced it were little and flexible, utilizing every one of their abilities to move gradually through the frenzy, prompting distortions after the wine tool region. The entry points up for another 5 ft or so, then turns down over a stone edge with a sharp 90-degree twist to one side. As of not long ago, cavers had utilized this little region after the wine tool to direct back toward themselves if necessary and head back through the troublesome segment 5 years before. A 16-year-old kid named Brock Clark was trapped in this wine tool segment. He was just 5'7" in tall and weighed 140 hours. Weaver got wedged when he was attempting to pivot. It took 14 hours for heroes to free him. John was in the specific place where Brock got adhered attempting to pivot. Since John was 6 feet tall and 200 lb, he plainly realized that pivoting in this piece of the passage was impossible for him. He was in a 12-in high space with insufficient horizontal region for his squeezed body to jumble for a turn. He drove forward to the edge region and crushed off the highest point of. It was a tight region to overcome. Yet he figured he could see it open up down underneath. He sucked in his stomach and squeezed himself through the press. Pulling forward on the rocks before him, he would be moving headfirst in a downwards point. Now, however, it appeared as though there was a region ahead to pivot. John didn't know it yet. No other person had at any point gotten over this edge before he was in totally unfamiliar area. Regardless of being in a very close and awkward position, John maintained a calm demeanor. He was sure that there would be an opening ahead from the start. He assumed he was in some piece of the berth waterway where us cavers had felt stuck in the contracting burrow. In any case, turned out to be okay once they arrived at the opposite side. Once he went through a tight zone, he began to slide toward the lower part of this passage. He was almost doing a handstand, attempting to hold his body up and sort out some way to push in reverse. He actually couldn't flip around, and presently gravity was pulling his 200 lb body against the blurring strength of his arms. He shouted out to his sibling Josh and told not to follow him, however to return out. They examined his choices and concluded that pushing ahead to attempt to pivot was the smartest thought. He was falling onto his shoulders and head as of now, and expected to take action to escape this upward position. His headlamp provided him with a brief look at an opening in the floor ahead, which could prompt a bigger space. He felt somewhat more confident now, imagining that they would be chuckling about this misfortune over Thanksgiving supper. He made the slight turn and headed towards the opening. Precisely the way in which he found himself mixed up with this passage opening is obscure. It's felt that he might have hit his head and became wedged in the restricted space. The other idea was that he searched in the opening, however misconstrued what he saw, thinking it was an opening and not just an impasse. Fisher, one way or another, John had wound up in a little opening in the lower part of this passage, which was unimaginably limited, only 18 in by 10 in, not a lot greater than the screen of a PC. Ended up wedged almost totally topsy-turvy at a 70-degree point. He had invested some energy attempting to propel himself back upwards out of his opening. It was depleting. His arms were stuck in a pointless position. One collapsed under his chest and the other caught on a stone. Somewhere around his side, he stressed against the walls and immediately understood that all of his work wouldn't move him back up 5T to the shallow passage. His calves and feet were still let loose in the entry. Yet his legs were currently wedged on the littlest side of the opening, just 8 in wide. He began shouting for Josh again. His sibling realized that he was attempting to pivot, so his hollers were not a decent sign. Josh advanced once more into this restricted space and navigated the wine tool way. However, not at all like his sibling. He went feet first. This time he went on toward John's voice up over the edge. He at last came to a disturbing sight. He could see the finish of his sibling's leg standing out of the stone as though it had gulped down him. He crawled forward until his feet could press one of John's legs. He attempted to hold and pull up while John pushed from his end. After a few primitive endeavors, they were both inclination depleted and disappointed. Josh could see that this was intense, and they would require proficient assistance to get him out. They concurred that Josh ought to go find support, and John ought to attempt however much as could be expected to keep mentally collected and loose. While Josh went for help, one of the other family companions went into the area to address John and let him in on that he was in good company for a few hours. John just stayed caught, topsy-turvy, zeroed in, generally on the errand of breathing. The fisher crushed his chest where just shallow breaths were conceivable. Each of his endeavors to climb had really settled him more profound into the break as time went on. Gravity kept on pulling him against the harsh walls of the passage, fixing its grasp on his depleted body. Whenever help had shown up, the main cavern, hero Susie Matta advanced toward where John was stuck. It was presently 12:30 in the first part of the day, and John had been topsy-turvy for 3 hours. Susie was only 5'3" in tall, so dealing with the wine tool region was a lot simpler for her. Ropes had been attached to her lower legs as a safeguard, on the off chance that she stalled out too. She kept an eye on how John was doing and let him in on that. They'd get him out. He probably had a little flood of help. Imagining that expert assistance had shown up, and he would, before long, be liberated from this trap. Sui tied webbing lashes around his legs and afterward took care of it. Back to the pit where the passage began. A few endeavors were made to pull on the ropes to use John back up and out of the visor. There was simply a lot of grating on the ropes to make any powerful delivery on John. He was as yet stuck without the utilization of his arms to completely help in the wake of endeavoring a couple of things, and taking into account numerous forceful choices, the choice was made to enroll a pulley framework altogether. To assist with lifting John up and out a pulley had been effectively utilized when Brock Clark was stuck 5 years before, despite the fact that they had an arrangement of how to help. This was not a simple area to work in. Each piece of gear should be gotten from the entry, which required almost an hour to arrive at the opposite side of Wine Tool. The passage was very close, and just more modest power devices could be completed in, and just a single individual could be in there to help at a time. And they should be little or wiry to travel through the section successfully. It was simply not a very smart arrangement. Every pulley carved out opportunity to introduce. During this time, cavers were attempting to chat with John, console him, and offer stories to keep him quiet and talking. He was a faithful Mormon and invested energy supplicating and singing to look for comfort in this unbelievable circumstance. John had gone through the night topsy-turvy and was giving indications of the actual limits of the body to endure this position. The human body was not made to be topsy-turvy for long. The whole circulatory framework is planned utilizing beats of strain from the heart to push blood ahead through the framework, while valves and stringy vessels would hold blood and prevent it from going in reverse. This one-manner stream adjusts pressure, gravity, and valves to keep oxygen accessible to all tissues and to eliminate poisons from the body through the kidneys. John's body had been battling gravity for over 12 hours. The cerebrum was not worked to endure this sort of liquid tension. Liquids were developing in his lungs and poisons were beginning to aggregate from the absence of appropriate course. His organs were pushing on his lungs, and every breath was a debilitating exertion for muscles not worked for such work. His breathing was easing back and he was totally burnt through from the energy over the course of the night. He had gone from being totally quiet and clear to weakly whipping his legs and fantasizing. It was painful to look for. The heroes, they were defenseless, depleted, and feeling caught themselves. The air in this cavern framework was warm and sodden. It required a coordinated work to remain smoothly breathing when you are confined and can't move or try and inhale appropriately. Yet, the heroes realized they could get out when required. John didn't have that extravagance. He was unable to extend his chest to inhale, and the air around him was losing its oxygen focus gradually. During this time, a wired telecom framework was carried down to where John was stuck. His significant other talked with him, empowering him to hold tight and be reliable. John guaranteed her that he would be out with her soon. It was only after 4-0. That day that they at last got the pulleys set up to move. Ryan Schertz was in the passage when the framework was prepared to attempt. John's body had subsided into the thin side of the opening, so Ryan needed to push his legs over as the group pulled from outside. Each hurl moved him inch by inch up in the clear. At this point, John's legs were in horrendous torment. A rope had been tied around his legs for quite a long time, as Heros attempted different strategies to help him out. They were totally blue and had no detectable heartbeat at this point. Each pull had him shout to stop, as his nerves were ultra-delicate. As of now, they stopped to give him a second to collect himself, and afterward attempted once more. It was, by all accounts, working. John was at last being pulled up out of this opening. He was raised enough for Ryan to peer down to visually connect with him and passed down a cylinder to drink Gatorade. This work was very sluggish going, and they were completely depleted from the troublesome exertion. Ryan was pressed in a passage only 12 in high and had his head close to John's legs as they worked him gradually out of the tight 10 in fissure. Despite the fact that they were making some advancement in lifting him up, they were no nearer to getting him out. His legs were stirring things up around town roof over his passage, and winding them into the entry was unthinkable. He had zero power over his legs now, following 19 hours, topsy-turvy without his assistance, to carefully twist his knees to the side. They were emphatically considering breaking his legs to get him back into the section, since there was just no time left for John. Then, in an unexpected snapshot of blinding torment, Ryan shut down when he came to. He was draining vigorously. Furthermore, confounded the rope holding the pulley to a characteristic curve segment in the cavern broke and whipped the carabiner and pulley straightforwardly into Ryan's face. He endured harm to his face, lip, and tongue, as well as a blackout he needed to leave rapidly. Jay was back, where he began totally wedged in the passage, with the dissemination to his arms, cut off, and his legs totally dead. He couldn't assist with liberating himself in any capacity. This second begun the last death of John Jones. After Ryan was looked at in the pit and afterward shipped off to the clinic, his dad Dave had his spot in the entry with John. It required an hour to restore the pulley lines, and Dave attempted to tie a rope around John's body, yet couldn't get the rope past his wedged middle. So constantly, Dave was with John. He was not responsive this whole situation. Expected John's assistance to successfully save him. It was basically impossible to lift his 200 lb6T outline without him pushing and attempting to use himself somehow or another in Dave's work to tie up John. Stalled himself out for around 15 minutes. Their frantic work to assist with saving this man had endangered the two, his child and himself. It was an overwhelming reality. Whenever he had propelled himself back into the 12 in burrow, he was depleted and needed to leave. Brandon. Koalas had his spot and gotten the telecom framework so Jay's family could converse with him, his significant other. Emily communicated her affection and advised him to enjoy some time off, rest after all of his work. She still genuinely accepted he would be emerging. Yet Brandon could see what she couldn't. John was as of now not responsive, and no indications of something going on under the surface could be heard. Over the past few hours, Ryan detailed the murmuring breaths that John was battling with now. There was quiet. The salvage group assembled in the pit region inside the cavern and examined the circumstance. It was resolved that a clinical expert would have to affirm that he had really passed. A paramedic was sent into the tight segment to affirm what was thought at 11:56 on Wednesday, November 25. The John Jones was articulated dead. The salvage groups labored for 24 hours in a row to attempt to free John. However, it was simply not conceivable. With his topsy-turvy position, the clock was ticking, and he just used up all available time. John endured an unprecedented 27 hours in a rearranged position, which is quite a bit longer than whatever was anticipated as conceivable. The 6 salvage workforce who really arrived at John in that rough jail were genuinely courageous. They persistently positioned themselves in a part of the cavern that was unmapped, with many known takes a chance. They were magnanimous in their endeavors, kept a quiet disposition, and never abandoned an apparently unimaginable salvage. After they discovered that recuperating the body would be unimaginable, John was passed on to rest in the Ed's Push part of the Nutty Clay Cave forever. The whole cavern framework was deterred with concrete at absolutely no point ever to be investigated in the future. A plaque was set there to celebrate the existence of John Jones.